When I was an environmental science major in college, I knew that there was the plastic issue and there was climate change and there was a myriad of other issues. But I personally thought, you know what, climate change is the biggest problem right now. I see a lot of my friends focusing on plastic pollution and all that kind of stuff. And I'm like, you know, I want to solve that issue too, but I need to focus on climate change. Oh, did I not think about how plastic was made? Yeah, they are directly connected. 99% of plastics comes from fossil fuels. In order to solve climate change, we kind of need to solve the plastic issue too. Hey y'all, it's Becky here from the Beckosphere, where we talk about climate news and solutions. You've entered a climate deep dive, and this time we are going to go into the connection between fossil fuels and plastics, and boy is there a lot there. So let's get into it. 99% of plastics comes from fossil fuels. Basically, plastic is kind of a plan B for fossil fuels if we actually successfully transition our energy sector to 100% renewable energy. In fact, plastic production has gone up so much despite there being several laws by many countries and cities and counties to reduce their plastic production. Plastic has still increased in production over the last several years. So how is that the case? What is happening? Well, it turns out that there's a direct connection between increase of plastic production and an increase of fracking. So in order to explain the whole thing, let's start by just going over how plastic is made. So plastic is made of polymers, which is a bunch of molecules put together in a very tough chain, which is one of the reasons why plastic is so appealing, because it's basically indestructible, which is also one of its biggest downfalls because it means that it can't be broken down for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Polymer complexes are usually in the form of either ethane or propane, and those come from fracking.
Fracking is short for hydraulic fracturing, the process of getting natural gas and oil out of sedimentary rock called shale. Fracking wells are built to blast large amounts of water, chemicals, and sand deep underground into the shale, causing it to fracture and release trapped natural gas and oil. The oil and gas is then piped up to the surface and sent to a plant to be used in homes and industry. The water, which is now contaminated with chemicals and radioactive materials present in the shale, also rises to the surface and must be sent to a treatment facility or stored underground in a new injection well. Wastewater and backflow from fracking adds up to 1 trillion gallons a year.
From there, the fossil fuels are sent to refineries where they are converted into several products, including the building blocks of plastic, ethane from crude oil, and propane from natural gas.
So then those chemicals go to what is called a cracking site. Basically, it breaks down ethane into ethylene, and it breaks down propane into propylene. Now, these chemicals, when added with a catalyst, can produce a resin that can be formed into many different shapes. So basically, it makes the molecules more flexible to being moved around. Now, usually that ends up as these little circular things called nurdles, which are the main way that ethylene and propylene are then transported to different plastic production locations. So those little nurdles, they kind of look like fish eggs, and that will become more important later on. So after the nurdles are made, they are then shipped to wherever plastic is then turned into the products that we see today. So that is the general gist of how plastic is created. So now let's go down each one of those parts and see the environmental and health impacts of each of those areas. So fracking in the United States has actually increased by 1,204% from the year 2000 to 2015. That's basically from 23,000 wells to over 300,000 wells. Now, fracking uses a lot of water, up to 1.5 to 16 million gallons of water per well. And that number, as you can tell, is very varied, and that depends basically on what rock is trying to be broken up, who the operator is, if they like to use a lot of water, whether or not the well is horizontal or vertical, and how much that well is being fracked. And very little of that water gets reused. Though to be honest, that's probably for the best, because that water generally gets a lot of additives added to it. Because when you are shoving water against a rock that's been deep underground for many, many years, you get some things that come back up. Interesting chemicals, minerals, and even some radioactivity. But one of the main things that ends up in the water system is methane. Now, coincidentally, methane is not regulated in water supply by the EPA, which means we don't know exactly how much methane is added to the local water supplies near fracking sites. However, we do have these wonderful videos of residents lighting their tap on fire, so needless to say, it might be a decent amount of methane. One fracking site around a water supply might not use up the water supply too much, but when you start adding up the amount of fracking sites, it can quickly impact the local water supply. So it impacts how much locals have, and it impacts what quality of water they end up getting. And usually there's a lot of fracking sites around an area. They kind of accumulate. Here's a quote from the EPA. Between the year 2000 and 2013, approximately 3,900 public water systems were estimated to have at least one hydraulically fractured well within 1 mile of their water source. These public water systems served more than 8.6 million people year-round in 2013. An additional 3.6 million people were estimated to have obtained drinking water from non-public water supplies in counties with at least one hydraulically fractured well. Now, the health impacts of living near a fracking site come plentiful, whether or not it has to do with consuming the water or just breathing the air around. Many people have reported gastrointestinal issues, pregnancy issues, and respiratory conditions such as asthma, as well as conditions such as cancer. In fact, the radioactivity in those sites, if inhaled, can increase the risk of cancer significantly in a person, specifically lung cancer. Sites that are 12 miles downwind from a fracking site can have an increase of 7% radioactivity compared to normal. Now, to be honest, that's really not too much, but the radioactivity level does increase the closer you live to a site. The radioactivity comes from naturally occurring minerals that got lodged up during the fracking process. A study by the American Journal of Nursing collected a bunch of different health studies of patients near fracking sites to come up with an overall picture of different health implications. And they had this to say, quote, "Of the more than 350 that were investigated further, 75% were found to potentially affect the respiratory and gastrointestinal systems, the liver, and various sensory organs." Honestly, not enough health information regarding fracking sites has been collected by the EPA, and I'm sure that must just mean that the fracking process is new, and so they haven't really caught up with that yet. Oh, you're telling me that we've been fracking since 1940 and we still don't have a lot of information? So the cracking process requires a lot of heat, which means that the process has a lot of energy demand. Basically, the cracking process produces the equivalent emissions to 52 coal-fired plants. And if business as usual is continued, that can go up to 69 coal-fired plants by just 2030. So now let's take a look at one of the more well-known case studies of people living around petrochemical sites, which petrochemical, one of their main products is plastic. That would be Cancer Alley, which is located in Louisiana along the Mississippi River.
This is the petrochemical corridor, an 85-mile stretch of land along the Mississippi River that is home to more than 150 industrial plants that produce stuff like rubber, asphalt, and refined oil. But the people who live here have another name for it.
The chemical corridor, commonly known as Cancer Alley.
It is considered by environmentalists as an environmental sacrifice zone. Basically, imagine having 13 petrochemical sites around a 3-mile radius of your home. And this is not only just a health problem, but it's also an environmental justice issue. 2/3 of people living near those sites are African American. And that's basically because in the history books, Black concerns were not taken as seriously as white concerns. So when white people were like, don't put those sites near me, they were listened to. When Black people said the same thing, they still put them there. And the main argument that petrochemical sites said was that it would provide economic opportunity for those areas. However, they ended up bringing their own people there. There was not any job training opportunities for those that lived near the sites to actually be able to work there. Pretty much everyone that lived there either had cancer or knew someone who died from cancer.
I have 100 people in the meeting. Has anybody in the room had anybody in their house die of cancer? Everybody stand up.
Someone just passed away 3 houses down from cancer.
Because I had one friend, I went and visit her on 4th Street on a Friday. And that Monday morning, I got up, I said, I'm gonna go see Mary Alice. I got a call, she was dead.
And because a lot of them suffer from respiratory issues, they are also more susceptible to the pandemic. And it was basically a COVID hotspot. And now it's a Delta hotspot. Since the video in 2017, the petrochemical sites have basically just expanded. In 2020, the Bucket Brigade sued Formosa Plastics for a new project that was being built that, if finished, would be one of the largest petrochemical sites in the world. They sued them for $9 billion. And the UN estimated that that would have basically doubled the amount of cancer found in the local town of St. James Parish, which is a predominantly Black area. In January, President Trump became the first president to basically call out Cancer Alley by its name as he was signing some legislation that involved environmental justice. He specifically called out Cancer Alley as an example of environmental racism, and that was further emphasized by a UN report that said that Cancer Alley was completely unacceptable and a clear example of environmental racism. Quote, "This form of environmental racism poses serious and disproportionate threats to the employment of several human rights of its largely African American residents, including the right to equality and non-discrimination, the right to life, the right to health, right to an adequate standard of living, and cultural rights." Upon this accusation, the governor of Louisiana went on a media spree, pointing to data from Louisiana's tumor registry, which did not show any higher rate of cancer in areas near petrochemical sites compared to areas away from them. However, because that was done recently, the residents argued that those numbers would not be accurate because many people who would have died from cancer instead died from COVID. Victims also might have not sought out medical treatment due to societal or financial concerns. And for those chemicals that the EPA does check, there is a confirmation that the areas by petrochemical sites are above chlorofluorine levels. So even if they weren't checking methane or checking cancer rates, there is still an unacceptable level of certain chemicals near those sites. So that in itself should be an environmental concern and health concern. But there is some good news. On August 25th of this year, so like last week, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers announced that they would do an in-depth environmental review of the Fortuna plastic site. Kind of a win for those that previously had sued the project. So we will see how that goes. The executive director of the Bucket Brigade had this to say, quote, "Today's announcement is the ultimate David versus Goliath victory." So that's more of the health implications of fracking and cracking sites. But let's go back to the little fish egg size nurdles. So the US supplies 10% of Europe's ethylene supply, which means that they ship the little nurdles across the sea to Europe, and also to different locations, and other countries do that too. So there are massive ships of these tiny little fish egg sized nurdles. You see where I'm going with this?
The Express Pearl has been ablaze for 2 weeks, and despite the efforts of the Sri Lankan and Indian navies, it's sinking.
And it was carrying nurdles. Soon, the Sri Lankan people started to see fish washing up dead with nurdles in their stomach and in their gills. And this, because nurdles don't get broken down unless the nurdles wash up on shore and get immediately cleaned up, or they get washed up in the form of dead fish, dead turtles, and dead dolphins, then they're still going to be in the environment polluting that area for a while. And the fish will eat them thinking that they're full when they get no nutritional value, and then they die of starvation. It seems like every part of the plastic production either involves health implications or environmental implications. And to be honest, I haven't even gone into once we get the plastic into use, because there's already problems with that too, such as chemicals leaking into our bodies and how much microplastics we consume. Hell, microplastics are so tiny now that they are in our water cycle. But that is a whole other video to do.
Plastics are everywhere, from food to water and even in our bodies. It is estimated that about 8 to 10 million tons of plastic waste enters our oceans every single year. This has caused devastating impacts for multiple marine species. We have seen images and videos of many animals being choked or entangled in plastics. Furthermore, this plastic waste breaks down into tiny pieces of plastic called microplastics, which are smaller than 5 millimeters. Microplastics are so pervasive that they've been found in the deepest part of the ocean, the Mariana Trench. Furthermore, zooplankton, which are the base of the marine food chain, have been captured consuming microplastics, and microplastics have even been found in the human placenta and our digestive systems. This issue is extremely serious, and action must be taken now.
Hi, my name is Ankur Shah, and welcome to my YouTube channel. I make videos on environmental and cultural issues with a focus on how we can leave the world better than we found it.
So speaking of nurdles, that's a really bad transition, nerds like me, Ankur Shah did a video recently. We kind of partnered in our video release, and he's doing a video on plastic pollution, particularly in the ocean. So if you would like to go more into depth on what then happens after we use the plastic and throw it to the side, go ahead and check out his video. Also, I recommend Climate Town's video where he talks about plastic recycling. Basically, the recycling industry is broken. I do want to quickly mention that there are a lot of alternatives to plastics that people are coming up with, whether or not it's in the form of bioplastics, though then I have to get into the whole conversation of industrial composting versus regular composting, because they're not the same thing. So when you see something that says compostable, it's probably industrially compostable, which means that you couldn't put it into a compost and it would decompose. That's not how it works. And there's also a difference between biodegradable and compostable. There's a lot to talk about. But basically, there are other plastics that are more naturally made that are coming onto the market. The problem is that they're just not as economically feasible right now. And then there's also different forms of tough material that could be used in replace of plastic, such as hemp. So there are interesting things that are coming online. It's kind of like we have multiple things to look at here. We have where the plastic goes that is used, how to reduce our own plastic input using longer term items, and what are some alternatives for short-term plastic items, because we're not going to completely get rid of using short-term items, especially in places like the medical industry, where it just is helpful in the way of sanitary needs. So there's many different elements to talk about in regards to that. My main suggestion though is if you see legislation like the type that's currently coming out of California to ban plastic items or to increase clarity in what is recyclable and what is not, definitely make sure that you vote on that. In your own personal life, find ways to reduce your plastic use. Recycle is no longer the most important term in the 3 R's. Now reduce and reuse, those are the really most important items. Reduce the amount of plastic production that comes your way and reuse as much as you can. Though maybe don't reuse like water bottle, like the single-use ones, because as we talked about, microplastics in the body. Don't reuse things that weren't really meant to be reused, I guess. I don't know, it gets a little complicated, but try to reduce the amount of plastic that you can. To some extent, it is honestly kind of a privileged thing to be able to reduce the amount of plastics you use, but in many cases, bringing your own water bottle instead of using a ton of plastic water bottles is a really good start. So let me know what you think about all this in the comments below. Did you know how connected plastic production was to fossil fuels? I really didn't, and I don't think it's talked about enough. Until next time, I will talk to you all later. Bye. Shoo.